For more than a century, the bones sat far from the desert that buried them. They were not found beneath a pyramid. They were not sealed in a royal chamber. They did not belong to a pharaoh or a general or a name remembered by history. They belonged to one man. An older man buried inside a large pottery vessel placed in a rock-cut tomb at Nuwayrat in Middle Egypt. He lived roughly 4,500 to 4,800 years ago, near the moment when Egypt was becoming something larger than a kingdom along the Nile. Central power was hardening. Monumental architecture was rising. The first pyramids were beginning to appear. For generations, ancient Egypt has often been imagined as a civilization almost enclosed by its own geography. A world protected by desert, fed by the Nile, developing its temples, kingship writing, and rituals with a kind of majestic isolation. But inside the teeth of this one man, that story became unstable. When scientists finally recovered and sequenced his genome, they found something no object alone could prove. Most of his ancestry was connected to Egypt and North Africa, but roughly 1/5 pointed east toward the Fertile Crescent, the ancient world that included Mesopotamia. Not a rumor in art. Not a borrowed symbol carved on stone. Not a trade good carried across distance. A signal inside the body. The first complete ancient Egyptian genome ever recovered had not confirmed isolation. It had opened a corridor. And what lay beyond it was older, stranger, and more connected than the history books had allowed. The older picture of early Egypt was never simple. Archaeologists knew the Nile Valley was not sealed away from the wider world. Objects moved. Materials moved. Ideas may have moved with them. But the public image remained powerful. Egypt seemed to rise from the river itself. The deserts, to the east and west, looked like walls. The annual flood created order. The long ribbon of green land produced grain, labor, and kings. By around 3150 BC, Upper and Lower Egypt had been drawn into one political world. In the centuries that followed, that world became more centralized, more ambitious, and more capable of turning belief into stone. This was the threshold of the Old Kingdom, the age later remembered through pyramids. Mesopotamia, far to the east, seemed to belong to another story. Its cities grew between the Tigris and Euphrates. Its societies built their own temples, writing systems, trade routes, and ruling houses. In the old classroom version of civilization, Egypt and Mesopotamia were treated like parallel miracles. Two great river worlds, two cradles, two separate beginnings. Yet the archaeological record kept resisting that clean division. There were imported stones. There were artistic motifs that seemed to echo across regions. There were technical similarities, especially in crafts such as pottery. Scholars could see traces of contact. But contact through things is always difficult to interpret. A blue stone can travel without a family moving. A design can be copied without a stranger settling down. A technique can spread without leaving bones behind. So the question remained unresolved. Were Egypt and Mesopotamia merely exchanging objects across distance? Or had people themselves crossed the invisible line between these worlds? For decades, the answer was locked inside remains that seemed too damaged to speak. The man from Nuwayrat made the problem more personal. His remains were excavated in 1902 from a cemetery near Beni Hassan, about 270 kilometers south of Cairo. This was not Giza. It was not the theatrical center of Egypt's most famous monuments. It was Middle Egypt along the Nile corridor, where local life burial traditions and wider political change met in quieter ways. The body had been placed inside a large sealed pottery jar. The jar had been set within a chamber cut into the rock. It was an unusual protection for someone who did not appear to be a king. His skeleton was remarkably complete. He was an adult male, perhaps around 60 years old, which was a long life for his world. He was not tall, only about 1.59 meters. His bones showed age strain, osteoporosis, arthritis, and signs of dental infection. They also showed patterns of repeated movement. The clues suggested labor, not battlefield violence, not royal ceremony. Something more ordinary and more revealing, long hours spent in fixed postures, using the body in practiced repetitive ways. Researchers have suggested he may have been a potter or a skilled craft worker of a similar kind. And this created a contradiction. If he was simply a laborer, why was he given a burial that seems to have been more careful, more protected, and possibly more prestigious than expected? If he was an artisan, was his skill important enough to change his social position? Was he part of a craft tradition shaped by local practice, foreign influence, or both? For more than 100 years, the bones carried those questions silently. Then the answer began in the place most likely to survive. Not the tomb, not the jar, the teeth. Ancient Egyptian DNA has always been difficult to recover. The same climate that preserved monuments could destroy the smaller archive, inside bone. Heat breaks genetic material apart. Time reduces it further. Even when a body looks preserved, the DNA may be fragmented beyond use, contaminated, or gone. That is why this case mattered before the result was even known. The burial conditions were unusual. The body had been enclosed in pottery. The pottery had been sealed. The sealed vessel had then rested inside a rock-cut tomb. It may have created a more stable environment than the surrounding desert would normally allow. And inside the roots of 2 teeth, enough genetic material remained. Scientists sequenced the genome at low coverage about 2 times across the genome. It was not a perfect window. Ancient DNA rarely gives that. But it was enough to make the man measurable in a way that pottery art and architecture could never be. The radiocarbon date placed him between about 2,855 and 2,570 BC. That meant he lived at the edge of a transformation after the unification of Egypt, near the emergence of the Old Kingdom, around the time the first pyramids were being built. This was not late Egypt after centuries of empire and foreign contact. This was early. Then the ancestry result arrived. Around 80% of his ancestry aligned with ancient North African and Egyptian-related sources, but about 20% aligned with populations connected to the Fertile Crescent, the great arc of early farming societies that included Mesopotamia. The evidence did not say that Egypt came from Mesopotamia. It said something quieter and more difficult to ignore. At the very beginning of Pyramid Age Egypt, Eastern ancestry was already present in at least one Egyptian life. This changed the meaning of the older clues. Before the genome, the connection between Egypt and Mesopotamia could be explained through exchange. A stone moved, a vessel moved, a symbol moved. Trade could create resemblance without migration. Influence could travel without bloodlines. But this man carried the connection biologically. That does not make him Mesopotamian. It does not erase his Egyptian identity. The stronger signal in his genome remained local, tied to Egypt and North Africa. His burial, his setting, and his life belonged to the Nile Valley. The importance lies in the mixture. Somewhere before his lifetime, people with ancestry related to the Fertile Crescent entered the human story of Egypt. Perhaps through trade networks, perhaps through craft communities, perhaps through generations of movement, so ordinary that no monument recorded it. By the time this man died, the connection was no longer just foreign contact. It was family history. This is why the discovery is more powerful than a dramatic invasion story. It points to a world built through contact that did not always announce itself. The rise of Egypt was not a sealed miracle. It was not simply copied from the East either. It was a local civilization shaped by the Nile, but already participating in a wider ancient system of exchange, movement, and adaptation. The old question had been too narrow. People asked whether ideas moved from Mesopotamia into Egypt. The genome suggests a deeper possibility that some of the people connected to those worlds may have moved too, carrying techniques, habits, marriages, memories, and ancestry across landscapes that later histories divided into separate civilizations. The border between them was never as solid as it looked. In the end, the most important thing about the man from Nuwayrat may be how ordinary he was. He was not buried with a royal name that could bend history around itself. He did not leave a victory inscription. He did not command an army or build a pyramid. He lived, worked, aged, suffered, and died. Yet his bones survived long enough to disturb one of the cleanest stories we tell about the ancient world. Civilizations do not rise from empty landscapes. They rise from rivers, climates, labor, belief, ambition, and power. But they also rise from movement. From marriages, no chronicle records. From craftsmen crossing distance. From traders following routes older than kingdoms. From small, human decisions that later become invisible beneath monuments. The Nile gave Egypt its shape, but it was not the only force in the story. Inside one sealed jar, in one rock-cut tomb, in one man's teeth, there was evidence that early Egypt already belonged to a wider human map. Not as a borrowed civilization, not as an isolated miracle, but as something more real, a society rooted deeply in its own land while still connected to people far beyond it. That is the quiet reversal. The pyramids still stand in the desert, massive and silent, as if they emerged from Egypt alone. But beneath the age that built them, the evidence now points to motion. Before the stones rose upward, people had already moved across the world below.